Welcome the anointed ones. Never mistake a calm surface for shallow waters. Some of the deepest souls move in silence and sting when necessary. They thought you were naive. They looked at your patience and mistook it for passivity. Your kindness, misread as cluelessness. Your silence, a blank slate they thought they could write lies on. But what they didn't know is that the quiet one was actually the storm they weren't ready for. And when the tables turned, they flipped so hard they knocked over their own masks. Here's a fact that might shock you. According to psychology studies, manipulators intentionally target people they perceive as too nice, thinking they'll be easy to control. Translation? They saw your light and thought easy win. Instead, they got a spiritual boss battle on hard mode. This ain't about petty revenge. This is about the beautiful horror of underestimating a chosen one. You weren't loud, you weren't confrontational, but you were watching, calculating. And when you struck, it wasn't with noise, it was with precision. So buckle up, because in this video we're exposing what really happened when they played themselves by thinking you were some gullible puppet, and ended up realizing you were the one pulling every string from the start. Let's dive in. Number 1, they mistook your emotional intelligence for weakness until it outmaneuvered their manipulation. They thought you were weak because you felt things deeply, because you could sense shifts in energy, read a room without a word being said, and pick up on things others ignored. They looked at your emotional intelligence and rolled their eyes like it was some soft, useless trait. But the truth is, your emotional intelligence was the most dangerous weapon in the room, and they walked straight into it thinking you were too nice to notice what they were really up to. See, while they were trying to manipulate you, you were already decoding them. You weren't reacting because you were watching. You weren't arguing because you were understanding. That's what threw them off. You didn't fight back in the way they expected. You didn't explode, expose, or beg. You simply sat with the truth, saw it for what it was, and let it ripen. That silence, that calm. That wasn't fear, it was strategy. You were gathering evidence, not receipts, energy evidence. And once you saw enough, you made your move, quietly, powerfully, and without warning. What they didn't know is that you knew how to manage your emotions without letting them cloud your judgment. You knew how to sense fake apologies, manipulated kindness, and manufactured loyalty. And because you didn't always call it out immediately, they assumed you didn't see it. But you saw everything. You let them show their patterns. You let them repeat the cycle. And while they thought you were falling for it, you were documenting it in your spirit. You gave them space to change, not because you were desperate, but because you wanted to see if they'd rise. They didn't. And when they finally crossed that final line, you were already 10 steps ahead. You didn't need closure. You didn't need proof. You already had clarity. When you finally stood up for yourself, they were shocked. Not because you snapped, but because you outclassed them. You didn't stoop to their level. You simply walked away with your dignity, and it humiliated them. That's the part they'll never say out loud. They weren't ready for someone who could care that deeply and still walk away that completely. You weren't the fool in the room. You were the boss who let them think they had control until they didn't. Number 2, they played games with someone who had already read the rule book and rewritten it. They thought they were outsmarting you, thought they were playing you like a fool, pulling strings behind the scenes, thinking you couldn't possibly keep up with their tactics. What they didn't realize was that while they were trying to play games, you were busy studying their patterns. You weren't confused. You were collecting information. Every sly comment, every calculated move, every fake smile. They were just giving themselves away. They believed they had you trapped, that they were the ones calling the shots. But the truth is, you had already outgrown the level they were operating on. You saw through the game before they even made the first move. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who's seen real manipulation before, someone who's walked through fire and didn't come out bitter, just sharper. You weren't naive, you were observant. You let them think they had the upper hand, but deep down, you were 2 steps away from flipping the entire board. See, the reason they kept coming at you with manipulation is because they were projecting how easily they could be fooled. They thought you'd fall for attention, flattery, guilt trips, or control tactics, because that's how they operate. But they forgot one key detail. You weren't built for shallow games. You weren't impressed by fake power moves. You were already functioning on a level where authenticity is the currency, not manipulation. What makes it worse for them is that you didn't blow up their game with drama. You didn't call everyone and expose them. You just quietly made your exit. And in that silence, they lost all control. Because now they know. You let them think they were winning just long enough for them to hang themselves with their own rope. They underestimated you because you didn't flex, because you weren't loud, because you didn't need to prove anything. But in the end, they realized they were dealing with someone who wasn't even playing the same game. While they were busy strategizing for short-term wins, you were focused on long-term alignment. You weren't looking for revenge, you were making room for peace. And when you walked away, they finally understood the most dangerous kind of power is the kind that never needed to prove itself to begin with. Number 3, they bet on your silence, not knowing it was strategic, not submissive. They thought your silence meant you were clueless. They really believed that because you weren't reacting, you weren't aware, that you didn't have the guts to speak up or the strength to push back. But what they didn't understand is that your silence wasn't weakness. It was intelligence, it was control. You knew exactly what was going on, but you chose not to waste your energy proving it to people who had already shown you their true colors. They kept testing your patience, pushing your boundaries, trying to get a rise out of you so they could flip the story and make you the problem. But you weren't playing into that. You stayed quiet because you knew once you opened your mouth, the truth was going to hurt more than anything they could handle. You weren't trying to win arguments, you were watching them expose themselves. They were hoping you'd react emotionally so they could label you dramatic, irrational, or unstable. But instead you responded with nothing. No outburst, no explanation, just pure strategic silence. And that's what shook them, because people who depend on chaos hate when you don't give them the reaction they're fishing for. You starve them of the drama. You rob them of the control. That silence? That was you reclaiming your power without lifting a finger. They thought they had time to keep lying, keep manipulating, keep playing you. But you were never confused. You were just patient. You weren't buying into their lies, you were documenting them. And when you finally detached, it looked sudden to them. But to you, it was planned, calculated. You were never lost in the fog. You just let them think you were, so they could keep exposing how low they were willing to go. What's wild is that now they're angry at you for not playing along, mad that you didn't scream, argue, or beg, because that would have meant you still cared. But your silence said it all. You saw it, you accepted it, you moved on. That's what burns them now. They can't explain how the one they thought they had wrapped around their finger is now the one they can't reach, can't understand, and can't manipulate anymore. You didn't go quiet because you lost. You went quiet because you already won. Number 4. They laughed at your kindness, not realizing you were the storm wearing a smile. They thought your kindness was a joke. Every time you gave them grace, they thought you didn't notice what they were doing. They mistook your patience for oblivion, thought that because you chose to stay calm, you didn't have limits. Because you didn't clap back, you couldn't. Because you loved with softness, you lacked power. But they never stopped to ask themselves why someone like you had such control, why you didn't fight dirty, why you chose peace instead of pride. It wasn't because you were naive, it wasn't because you were scared. It was because you were disciplined, You've seen destruction before, and you know how easy it is to become the very thing that hurt you. That's why you stayed graceful even when they disrespected you. That's why you smiled even when they tried to provoke you. You weren't ignoring their behavior. You were testing their character, and they failed that test miserably. They kept pushing, laughing, testing your boundaries like you were too soft to ever snap. But what they didn't realize is that your silence was not surrender, it was mercy. You were giving them space to correct themselves, time to grow, but the more you held back, the more they played with the illusion that you were powerless, until you weren't. There's always a final straw. And when they crossed that line, everything they believed about you fell apart. That sweet, calm, generous version of you they thought they controlled, gone. Not because you became someone else, but because you finally stopped shrinking to make them comfortable. And it hit them hard, not with shouting, not with vengeance, just with the undeniable presence of someone who finally remembered their worth and acted accordingly. The same smile that once gave them comfort suddenly became a warning. The storm didn't announce itself, it had been smiling the whole time. Now they call you cold, changed, unrecognizable. But the truth is, you were always powerful. You just preferred to lead with love. They laughed at your kindness. Now they're haunted by the calm before the storm, because they never saw the lightning coming. Number 5, they thought your loyalty was blindness, but you were watching them the whole time. They thought your loyalty meant you couldn't see the truth. They assumed that because you stood by them, defended them, forgave them, and kept showing up, you must have been blind to their actions. They really believed they were pulling the wool over your eyes, but what they didn't realize is that you weren't blind. You were watching everything. You saw the little lies. You felt the shift in energy. You noticed how their words didn't match their actions. You heard what they said when they thought you weren't listening. You watched how they moved when your back was turned, and even though your intuition was screaming, you didn't walk away right away, not because you were lost, but because you were testing them. You wanted to see if they would grow, if they'd take accountability, if they'd value your loyalty and rise to meet it. You were hoping that love, patience, and consistency might inspire change, but deep down you knew. You just needed them to show you one last time who they really were, so you could walk away with no doubts, no guilt, no second guessing. They thought they were getting over on you. They thought your loyalty was a weakness they could manipulate, but they didn't understand that your loyalty wasn't rooted in ignorance. It was rooted in choice. And once you chose to stop giving, stop explaining, stop showing up, there was no turning back. When you walked away, you didn't leave broken or bitter. You left with clarity, with all the emotional receipts you had been collecting in silence, with dignity intact, with your power fully reclaimed, and with the peace of knowing you gave them every chance to do right, and they still chose wrong. Now they're scrambling, confused, and trying to figure out how they lost someone so loyal. But the truth is, they lost you the moment they mistook your loyalty for stupidity. They played with a heart that was watching everything behind the scenes. And when you finally stepped, it wasn't out of emotion. It was out of finality. You were never blind, you were just loyal on purpose. And once your purpose shifted, so did your presence. Forever. Number 6. They assumed your spiritual path meant you were easy to manipulate. They assumed your spiritual path made you soft. That because you talked about God, healing, and forgiveness, you were someone they could take advantage of without consequences. In their mind, you were a safe target, too loving to confront, too forgiving to hold accountable, too peaceful to fight back. They heard you speak about grace and thought you didn't know how to set fire to a lie. They saw your faith and mistook it for fragility. But what they didn't realize is that your spirituality didn't make you weak. It made you wise. You weren't walking around with your head in the clouds. You were grounded in truth, fully awake and deeply aware. You weren't out here floating. You were discerning. You felt everything in the spirit before it manifested in the natural. And while they thought they were fooling you, you had already seen them in prayer. You didn't react because you were waiting. You didn't confront them immediately because you were listening to your intuition, to God, to your higher self. And when the time came to move, you moved with precision, not out of rage, but from revelation. You didn't need to explode, you just let the truth do the cutting. They thought you were harmless because you led with love. But love doesn't mean being a doormat. Love sets boundaries. Love says, I won't allow you to dishonor my spirit while I'm trying to elevate yours. They underestimated that part. They expected submission. But what they got was spiritual authority. You knew when to go into intercession, but also when to go into warfare. You knew when to turn the other cheek and when to stand your ground. You weren't trying to destroy anyone, but you also weren't going to let them destroy you. They assumed your path required you to shrink. But it was the very thing that taught you how to rise. And now that they've seen the other side of you, the protective, powerful, discerning side, they're quiet. Not because you changed, but because you finally revealed what you had been holding back all along. Spiritual doesn't mean stupid. Spiritual means you see the unseen and still choose your moment. You don't strike for revenge. You strike when God says it's time. Number 7. They exposed themselves by overestimating your ignorance. They thought they were smarter than you, thought they were slick with their words, calculated with their moves, and strategic enough to stay undetected. They believed they were 10 steps ahead, like you were just too naive, too slow, or too trusting to ever figure them out. They walked around confidently, thinking they were hiding their intentions behind charm, fake concern, or shallow compliments. But what they didn't know was that you already knew. You had already seen through the cracks in their performance. Your spirit picked up on what their words tried to hide. You noticed the tone, the inconsistencies, the patterns. You were aware the whole time, but you didn't interrupt their performance. You let them talk, you let them reveal themselves. Because you understood something they didn't. People eventually tell on themselves if you give them enough room. You didn't rush to confront. You didn't panic or try to force clarity. You stayed quiet, watched closely, and let them get comfortable lying. The more they thought you were clueless, the bolder they became. And that's when they made their biggest mistake. Thinking your silence was confusion instead of confirmation, they kept talking, and every word tightened the noose around their own truth. They exposed themselves, not because you backed them into a corner, but because they were arrogant enough to believe you weren't watching. They underestimated how deeply you observe, how much you pick up without needing to ask, how dangerous you become when you already know and choose not to speak yet. They assumed they were in control, but you were holding the truth the whole time like a quiet weapon. And when everything finally came to light, they looked shocked, but not because the truth was new. They were shocked because you had it the entire time and never once let on that they were performing for someone who had already read the script. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves. You just stood there, calm, watching them hand deliver the evidence. Because some people don't get caught, they unravel. And in trying so hard to fool you, they played themselves completely. Number 8, they tried to teach you lessons from a lower consciousness. They really believed they were schooling you, thought they were the mastermind in the dynamic. They played their little games, set traps, pushed buttons, withheld affection, tested your patience, all because they thought they were teaching you a lesson. They wanted to humble you, control you, show you how the world works. In their mind, they were in the position of power, thinking they were a level above you. But what they didn't understand is that you weren't operating from ego. You were operating from alignment. You didn't meet them with resistance, not because you were weak, but because you recognized their mindset was beneath the frequency you were called to live in. You saw them trying to manipulate, trying to provoke a reaction, trying to prove a point, but the truth is, They were playing from a place of insecurity, and you saw it from the start. You just didn't engage because you knew better. You've already been through fire. You've already buried parts of yourself and resurrected with deeper truth. Your wisdom didn't come from books, trauma bonding, or social games. Your wisdom came from source, and that can't be taught, faked, or outperformed. They thought you were in need of their guidance, their correction, their discipline. But you had already survived things they'll never even understand. You had already healed from wounds they're still hiding behind their ego. You weren't confused. You were elevated. And that's exactly why they couldn't reach you, even when they tried to bring you down. You weren't being arrogant, you were being awake. You weren't looking down on them. You just saw the games they were playing as symptoms of a mind still trapped in survival mode. While they were busy trying to humble you, they never noticed how humble you already were. True humility is not about letting others step on you. It's about knowing your worth without having to scream it. That's what confused them. You weren't reacting, and they mistook that as needing to be taught a lesson. Not realizing you were the lesson. They can't educate a soul that's been to war and returned with divine clarity. You didn't learn your wisdom in manipulation. You earned it through surrender, pain, healing, and spiritual elevation. And now you move different because you are different. They tried to teach from the ground, but you were already flying. Number 9, they tried to provoke your crazy, but you showed them your calm is more terrifying. They poked, pushed, and provoked, waiting for you to snap. They wanted a meltdown, a reaction, something loud and messy they could point to and say, "See, this is who they really are." They tried everything: silent treatment, mind games, public disrespect, subtle jabs dressed as jokes. All of it designed to get you to lose your cool. They weren't looking for resolution. They were looking for ammunition. They wanted to trigger your crazy so they could feel justified in how they treated you. They needed you to explode because it would make them look sane. But what they got instead shook them even more. Your silence, your composure, your refusal to give them what they wanted. You didn't yell, you didn't break down, you didn't stoop to their level. You just looked at them, unmoved, like you already saw how the story would end. And that's when the fear kicked in, because they realized they had no control over you. The calm they thought meant shut down was actually clarity. You weren't bottling things up, you were stepping back, measuring, watching, choosing when and how to respond, instead of letting them dictate the tempo. You showed them the most terrifying truth. You don't need chaos to defend yourself. You don't need to scream to prove you're hurt. You don't need to attack to protect your peace. That calm, that silence, they weren't passive. They were a decision, a strategy. And it dismantled everything they were trying to build against you. They expected fireworks. You gave them stillness. They expected drama. You gave them closure without a single argument. And that hurt them more than any explosion could. Because nothing is more unsettling to a manipulator than realizing their tricks don't work on you anymore. You didn't avoid the conflict because you were scared. You avoided it because you refused to be their puppet. You chose power over performance. You stayed in control of your energy even when they did everything to rattle it. And now, they're stuck trying to provoke a version of you that no longer exists, the one who used to defend yourself at all costs. That version is gone. What they face now is someone who knows their own power and protects it with a silence that speaks louder than anything they expected. Number 10, they forgot you were a mirror. And they broke themselves trying to break you. They came at you with everything they had: lies, gaslighting, guilt trips, and manipulation. They projected their insecurities onto you and tried to make you carry the weight of their brokenness. Every time they felt small, they tried to shrink you. Every time they felt wrong, they tried to make you feel guilty. They didn't want to take responsibility, so they made you the villain in a story they were writing to escape their own reflection. What they didn't realize is that you weren't their enemy. You were their mirror. You didn't absorb their chaos. You reflected it. You didn't return their cruelty with more cruelty. You stood still, clear, honest, and that's what shattered them, because the version of you they attacked never struck back the way they expected. You didn't need to lie, twist, or manipulate. You just held up the truth. And the truth for them was unbearable. They thought if they threw enough dirt at you, something would stick. But the more they tried to smear you, the more their own hands got dirty. The more they lied, the more obvious it became who they really were. They kept trying to damage your name, but ended up destroying their own integrity, because every accusation, every false narrative, every insult, they all bounced back. Not because you were playing defense, but because you were standing in your truth. You weren't perfect, but you were real, and that's something they couldn't stand. Your presence made them confront what they were trying to avoid within themselves. You didn't provoke them. You exposed them without saying a word, just by being consistent, just by refusing to play along, just by choosing to remain grounded in who you are. They tried to break you, but every attempt cracked their own mask instead. And when they looked at you, all they saw was everything they had tried to hide. Their shame, their envy, their fear. It wasn't you that was too much. It was their reflection in you that they couldn't handle. You didn't fight to prove a point. You didn't retaliate to get revenge. You let the truth do the work. And in the end, it wasn't your hands that exposed them. It was their own reflection. You never had to break them. They did it to themselves, trying to break someone who simply mirrored back the reality they were too scared to face. Number 11. They thought they could dim your light. Now they need sunglasses just to think about you. They really thought they had you figured out. They believed that if they mocked you enough, ignored you enough, or surrounded you with doubt, you would eventually dim your own light. They thought ridicule could shrink your vision. That isolation could make you forget your worth. That discrediting your name behind the scenes would erase your influence. They didn't just want to see you quiet, they wanted to see you small, because your light unsettled them. It revealed everything they were pretending to be. And instead of doing the work to heal and grow, they chose to try and suppress the one thing that made you different, your radiance. But the more they fought you, the more they failed to understand one simple truth. You don't shine because people clap for you. You shine because that light was built in. You were born with something they couldn't fake, couldn't copy, and couldn't manipulate. They didn't give it to you, so they couldn't take it from you. Their attempts to silence you only amplified your voice. Their efforts to block you only cleared your path. What they meant for harm became your personal evolution. You became brighter, louder, stronger, not in spite of them, but because their opposition pushed you to uncover more of your power. Now the tables have turned. The same people who whispered your name with arrogance can't mention you without discomfort. The same ones who laughed at your dreams now can't scroll past your success without feeling exposed. Your existence became a mirror they can't escape, not because you tried to hurt them, but because you kept becoming everything they swore you'd never be. You didn't seek revenge. You didn't throw dirt back. You just kept glowing so consistently, so unapologetically, that even thinking about you now stings their eyes. You were never too bright. They were just too insecure to stand beside someone who didn't need validation to shine. And now, the very light they tried to put out is the same light that haunts them every time they remember what they tried to destroy and failed. Number 12. They miscalculated how much pain you could endure without breaking. They thought they could break you, thought that if they betrayed you enough times, disappointed you deeply enough, or kept pushing you past your limit, you'd eventually collapse under the weight. They were counting on your silence turning into surrender. They expected the pain to make you bitter, lost, or too wounded to rise. They kept hitting you in the same places, your heart, your trust, your loyalty, thinking if they just struck hard enough, they'd finally take you out for good. But they miscalculated everything. What they didn't see was the depth of your resilience. They underestimated the kind of soul that's been tested by fire before and learned how to walk through it without turning to ashes. You didn't just endure the pain, you learned from it, you studied it, you let it break the illusion, not your spirit. And when you came out on the other side, you weren't weaker. You were wiser, sharper, and more dangerous in your silence than they ever were in their attacks. You stopped needing revenge because growth became your answer. You stopped needing closure because peace became your boundary. Every betrayal you endured, you turned into a building block. Every lie told on your name became a lesson. And every time they thought they saw you fall, you were actually just repositioning, getting stronger in the shadows. You didn't fold, you transformed, you became more self-aware, more spiritually in tune, more discerning. The pain didn't harden your heart, it sharpened your vision. And now your scars aren't just reminders of what happened. They're weapons. You use them with precision, not to hurt, but to cut away everything that doesn't align with who you've become. Now the same people who tried to break you don't know how to face you. Not because you're cruel, but because you're no longer accessible. You've grown past the place where their chaos could touch you. They expected to bury you. Instead, they ended up planting you. And what bloomed is someone they can't manipulate, shame, or control. You didn't just survive. You built something from the pain. And now the ground they tried to break you on, that's your stage. That's your platform. That's your proof. Number 13, they thought they were destroying you, but they were building your legend. They really believed they were tearing you down. With every lie, every smear, every calculated betrayal, they thought they were slowly dismantling you piece by piece. They thought that by discrediting your name, turning people against you, and putting roadblocks in your path, they were writing your downfall. But the whole time they weren't writing your ending, they were unknowingly writing your legend. Every time they came for you, they made you more unforgettable. Every whisper behind your back only made people curious. Every attempt to sabotage you became another plot twist in a story that was never going to end the way they wanted it to. They didn't realize that the more they tried to destroy your reputation, the more they made you a mystery, someone people couldn't ignore, someone they wanted to understand, someone who kept rising when the math said you should have been done. They thought they were creating damage. But all they really did was give you a story that inspired strength. The rejection, that became your redirection. The gossip, that became your motivation. The attempts to block you, that's what taught you how to build your own doors. While they were busy trying to make you disappear, you were being refined, elevated, anointed. And instead of fading, you became a force. You didn't just survive, you became a movement. You became the reason people started believing in bounce-backs, comebacks, and miracles. You became living proof that endurance is louder than envy, that purpose is louder than pettiness, and now your name carries something more powerful than clout. It carries meaning. You're not defined by what you went through. You're defined by how you kept showing up anyway. They can't figure out how you're still here, still rising, still glowing, still outlasting storms you were never supposed to walk through. They wanted to label you the victim, but instead, you became the phenomenon, the one they couldn't stop, the one they couldn't bury, the one whose story became a mirror to their own smallness. They thought they were destroying you, but they were building your legend. And now, you don't need to explain a thing, you just keep walking because legends don't talk. They echo. Number 14, they assumed you needed validation, but your power came from self-recognition. They assumed your strength depended on their approval. They thought you needed their applause to feel valuable, like their recognition somehow defined your worth. So they withheld it. They stayed quiet when you succeeded. They looked away when you glowed. They downplayed your growth, hoping you'd question it too. They believed that if they didn't validate you, it would break you, that if no one clapped, you'd stop dancing. But what they didn't understand is that your power was never built on praise. Your confidence didn't come from a crowd. It came from clarity, from looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself before the world ever did. You didn't need them to tell you who you were. You already knew. And because of that, their silence couldn't stop your rise. Their shade couldn't dim your shine. Their indifference couldn't erase your impact. You clapped for yourself in rooms where no one else would. You celebrated your small wins, even when others tried to make them feel insignificant. You kept pushing, kept creating, kept growing, without a spotlight. And that's what confused them. That's what made them nervous. Because most people only move when there's an audience, but you moved from conviction. You weren't performing, you were becoming. You crowned yourself, not out of arrogance, but because you refused to wait for someone else to hand you what you knew was already yours. You stepped into your power without permission. You stopped shrinking to fit into rooms that weren't built for your brilliance. And you made peace with the fact that not everyone would understand you because you were never made to be understood by small minds. Now they're watching, trying to figure out how you built so much without their support. How you walk with royalty in your spine when they never gave you a throne. What they don't realize is you don't need a throne when you are the kingdom. You don't need applause when your soul already echoes truth. You don't need their validation when your existence itself is evidence. They thought withholding love would make you question your light. But all it did was remind you that your glow was never up for debate. You didn't wait for anyone to crown you. You crowned yourself, and now all they can do is watch and wonder how. Thought they were playing you. Thought they could manipulate you, provoke you, break you, and dim your light. They thought your silence meant weakness. Your kindness meant naivety. Your loyalty meant blindness. And your faith meant submission. But every assumption they made was rooted in their own limitations, not your truth. And the more they tried to control the narrative, the more they accidentally revealed who they were and who you've always been. You didn't fight dirty. You didn't beg for validation. You didn't collapse under the pressure. Instead, you observed, you endured, you healed, and then you rose quietly, powerfully, without asking permission. Every wound they inflicted became part of your evolution. Every betrayal added to your blueprint. You didn't just survive the attacks, you transcended them. You became someone they can't reach, can't control, and can't silence. You're not the victim of their games. You're the embodiment of everything they swore you'd never become. The calm they mocked now unsettles them. The light they tried to dim now burns through every lie they told. You became a mirror, a sword, a storm, and a legend, without ever losing your soul in the process. So let them talk, let them wonder, let them squint through the brightness of what they couldn't destroy, because the truth is you were never being broken, you were being built, not for approval, not for applause, but for purpose. And that purpose, it's unstoppable. Let this moment mark the chapter they never saw coming, and the one you always knew was yours. If this spoke to your spirit, don't just scroll away in silence. Stand up and stand with it. Hit that subscribe button if you know you're built different and you're done letting the world box you in. Like this video if you've ever had to rise in the dark when no one clapped for you. Drop a comment if they underestimated you, but you came back stronger. I want to hear your story, and most importantly, share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they're not crazy, soft, or broken. They're chosen. This is more than content, it's confirmation. Welcome to the community of the unshakable. Let's keep shining, louder than their doubts, brighter than their lies, and bolder than their expectations. We don't just glow over here, we blaze. God bless you.